All right, so we've got this season of Advent, and we have this cool candle, or this cool wreath that's got several candles on it, right? And I said briefly earlier that each of these candles have a sort of a symbolic meaning. They stand for something. So the first candle that we light is the candle for the patriarchs. Smash the patriarchy. Just relax, okay? We'll talk about it in just a second. The patriarchs, and then the prophets, specifically the ancient Hebrew prophets. John the Baptist, who is sort of the last prophet of the Old Covenant. I'll explain that a little bit in a moment. Mary, Jesus' mom, because listen, if you've got somebody that you're friends with, but you hate their mom for no good reason, like if their mom's, a piece of work, then okay, I get it. But like, if their mom's a thoroughly decent human being, how can you like someone but not care about their mom? Right? So we're like, Mary's cool, 2 thumbs up, pretty special, right? And then, of course, Jesus himself. And what this sort of does is it kind of maps out God's work of redemption in the world. Now, Judeo-Christian faith is what we call a historical faith. Not historical in that it's very, very old, though it is. It's historical in that what we believe is that the events of history aren't simply happenstance, but the events of history reveal eternal and spiritual truths and reveal God's activity in the world. And so we go through this, every now and again I give this like long arc of sort of what has been happening and what is happening and what will happen in history, in human history and in the history of creation. And we've got this idea in Judeo-Christian faith that God created everything and it was very good, but people screwed it up, right? And so then, well, we all like justice, don't we? Justice, justice, justice. Well, justice came and it kind of wiped everything out. Again, what do we do with wickedness? If there's going to be a good world, what do we do? How do we understand what wickedness is? And what do we do with wicked people and people who do wicked things? Right? We lock them all up. What do we do? We wipe them all out? What do we do? So there was justice in the flood, and then, guess what happened? We messed it up again. Because no one's perfect. Least controversial Christian doctrine of all time. Nobody's perfect. But the one that people get really hacked off about. Don't say I sin. Nobody's perfect. Well, it's the same thing. Like, same picture. Right? All right, and so then God does something different than just justice. He begins working out this plan of mercy and redemption. And he calls Abraham and makes certain promises. Well, his name was Abram, got changed to Abraham. Makes certain promises that through him, the whole world would be blessed. Right? Rather than judgment, mercy, grace, and blessing is coming. And that process is going to work its way out through Abraham and his offspring. Abraham has a couple sons. Actually, he has more than a couple, but that's all right. One in particular, Isaac. And Isaac is the inheritor of that promise. And then Isaac has a couple sons, Jacob and Esau. And Jacob is the recipient of these promises. And Jacob has 12 sons. They become known as the 12 tribes of Israel. Right? And God makes a covenant with the people of Israel, says, I'm going to be your God. There were slaves in Egypt. God delivered them out of slavery in Egypt, says, I'm going to be your God. You're going to be my people. Here's a law for you to have. When you live according to the law, it will go well for you, but when you don't, it will go badly for you. You are going to be conquered by foreign armies, exiled out of the land, and it's going to suck. But in faithfulness to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right, I'm going to bring you back into the land, and I'm going to make a new covenant with you. And this is what the prophets are talking about. The Hebrew prophets, the people of Israel, over and over and over again. We sang this song, and ransom captive Israel, and we can get kind of caught up as modern day Israel the same as biblical Israel, and maybe there's a bit of Venn diagram overlap, but actually if you kind of go like this, it's quite, not sure that's the same thing, guys, kind of stuff. All right, so the prophets are talking about this new covenant that's going to come, and then John the Baptist is the last of these sort of prophets of this old covenant, and he points to Jesus. And the Virgin Mary conceives and gives birth to Jesus, and here is God's work of redemption. Here is God's work of salvation, of forgiveness, of grace and mercy. And that's where we stand now. In this time where Christ is king, we look forward to his return where he sets the world to rights. And we got the question about what is good and what is bad. And what do we do with bad things and bad people and people who do bad stuff? Right? And what needs to happen so that we can be well situated for the good work that God is doing. All right, now, this morning we're talking about the patriarchs. And so I'm going to read a passage. Man, we could be here for a while. I'm going to be super disciplined to try to cut this steak in small bites, right? And make it sensible. But I learned things this week. I love when I learn things. I learned some stuff this week, and I need to be judicious in what I'm like, all right, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about this or not. All right, so we're going to read a passage in Genesis chapter 32. All right? Now, before we read it, I want to give a little bit of the occasion. What's going on here before we read this passage? Now, I told you that there's a guy called Abraham, and he had sons, particularly Ishmael and Isaac. He had other sons. After his wife Sarah died, he got married again and had more kids. But anyhow, Isaac was the one through whom the promises were going to pass through. And then Isaac had twin sons, Jacob and Esau. Esau was the first one born. Jacob came out second, and he was holding on to Esau's heel. And the name Jacob means deceiver or crooked, right? Jacob is a bit of a schemer. He's a bit of a swindler. He's like a loophole kind of guy. You know, anybody have a loophole friend? You know, that person who's like, this isn't on the menu. However, if you ask for it, they must give it to you. Yeah, you know that guy? All right? So this is Jacob. And he conned his dad into receiving Esau's blessing. He took advantage of Esau to get his birthright. He deceived his uncle Laban in order to get bigger flocks. Laban deceived him. He thought he was marrying Rachel. And Laban got him drunk and ended up marrying off Rachel's older sister Leah to him first. And he didn't know it till the next day. Can you imagine? That's a hangover to have, you know? All right? So Jacob is a bit of a swindler. He's a bit of a, loophole kind of guy. Other people do the same thing to him. He's on the run. He's got all these flocks, right? He's got his two wives now, Rachel and Leah. He's got their two maidservants. He's had 11 kids at this point in time across the four of them. This just goes to show not every story in the Bible has a moral that we're supposed to follow. All right? All right? And he's about to meet his older twin brother Esau, who he has swindled over and over and over again. And he is sure that Esau is going to want to kill him. And he comes to the river Jabbok, which sounds kind of like Jacob. And in Hebrew language, really likes wordplay. It has a lot of fun with these kinds of things. So Jacob comes to the river Jabbok. He's about to meet Esau, and this is what happens. Genesis chapter 32. We'll start in verse 24. Because he had sent all of his wives and all of his kids and all of his goods across the river ahead of him. So Jacob was left alone and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. Well, that's just weird. Let's stop there. Jacob was alone at night and just a random man wrestles with him. Weird. All right? But let's carry on. Until daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with him. So that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with him, the man. I need new glasses, bro. This is rough. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What's your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It was because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." We're going to stop there. So here's this really strange occasion where Jacob wrestles with somebody at night, some mysterious man. His name gets changed to Israel so that his 11, soon to be 12 sons would be called the 12 tribes of Israel. And he says, he gets touched on his hip, limps the rest of his life, right? Gets a blessing, and we're like, what in the world is this all about? Is this simply an elaborate fable to tell us how Jacob came to be known as Israel, or is there something more to it? What I want to do now is talk about some of the ways in which people understand this passage. I want to talk about how I think it's good to understand this passage. And I want to talk about, okay, so what does that mean for us? All right? Now, some people will understand this passage as a typical way in which biblical literature mirrors folk religion or folk mythology of the time and place. We all know stories about things like river trolls or river spirits, grumpy spirits that are at a passageway, either over a river or over a canyon. There's a bridge and you've got to solve the riddle. And if you don't solve the riddle, you can't cross the bridge. Right? We know this kind of fantasy trope, this mythological trope. There's also, in ancient Near Eastern thinking, there's this idea about sort of territorial spirits, but they're bound to the nighttime. And in the daytime, they kind of disappear. They vaporize with the sunrise, like a vampire. It's like, no, not the sun, and has to run away. These spirits, they can be active at night, but in the daytime, they're no longer able to sort of function. These sort of like river trolls, territorial spirits, they tend to be unfriendly sorts. They tend to be understood as unclean spirits. Again, solve my riddle. I need, what's the one in Monty Python, they need the hedge. What's the hedge that they need? Nobody knows? Monty Python, the Holy Grail. I need a shrubbery. That's a shrubbery. Yeah, the nice to say need. That's what I'm looking for. Thank you. And we think of it like, I need a shrubbery. And until you come with a shrubbery or some random thing, you can't pass. All right? And so some academics, some scholars will say this is just the same thing, typical Bible stuff where they are just copying the folklore of the day. And maybe you've seen people on TikTok or Insta Reels or, whatever, or like YouTube Shorts who are like, actually, this story in the Bible is simply a regurgitation of other ancient Near Eastern mythology, and it just should be considered along the same lines. Right? Maybe you've heard that. Another way of understanding this is slightly more biblical. And that in the Bible, there's an understanding that nations, groups of people that might be tribes, ethnic groups, or nations, have sort of patron spirits. Right? So we think of the book of Daniel, and we've heard of the Prince of Persia. Right? Daniel's been praying to God for an answer to a particular question. Michael, the angel, gets to Daniel, but he's quite late in getting to Daniel. And Michael, the archangel, says, sorry, but I was detained by the Prince of Persia, which is understood to be a spiritual force, a spiritual being who is some way, shape, or form related to the Persian Empire. And that different tribes and nations and things like that would have sort of patron spirits or gods. For the Philistines, it was like Dagon. For different, whether it's Egyptians or the Greeks, there might be a pantheon of gods. And so some people say Jacob is getting ready to meet his brother Esau, who would become the leader of the nation called Edom, or the Edomites. And this is Esau's patron spirit that Jacob is wrestling with. Right? That's another very common, actually, particularly among Jewish scholars. That's a very popular interpretation. However, there's something really bizarre in that Jacob says, according to this bit of Hebrew scripture that we also recognize as Christians, he says, I'm going to call this place Peniel because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared. And so many Jews and Christians, particularly Christians, will say, no, this mysterious figure, this man, this angel of the Lord is in fact God. And we might think, well, how can that be? Well, let's just stop for a moment. If God is God, can he do whatever he would like? Of course he can. Does that have to conform to our understanding? No. God just gets to be and do who he is and what he wants. The omnipotence of God isn't that he can do anything. It's that he can do anything he wants to. There's a slight difference. So let's camp out on this over here for just a second. The omnipotence of God doesn't mean he can do anything. It means he can do anything he wants to. So, for instance, Scripture says God cannot lie. That's not something he can do. So if God were, let's say God shows up and he comes in and, whoa, hey, wasn't expecting that. Oh, I wasn't expecting God to show up at church? Weird. Let's think about that for a second. But anyway, God presents himself and looks at this carpet and says, that carpet's green. Liar. Now, we believe that God is a God who creates things simply by articulating them, right? Creation narrative. However, we understand that literally or metaphorically is irrelevant to the communication that when God speaks, something becomes. That which is not becomes that way. So if God were to declare, this carpet is green, I think one of probably 2 or 3 things would happen. One is it would just become green. It'd be like, wow, that was crazy. Did you see that? I saw that. It was blue, and then he said it was green, and it became green. That's wild. That might happen. Right? Or perhaps our collective these 2 things, or perhaps our collective understanding of what green is would change. Right? And we'd look at this, and we look at the sky, we go, oh, the sky is green, carpet's green. What green means has now changed in our collective understanding. Because God can't lie. One of those 2 things is going to happen. When God speaks, that which is not becomes. Romans chapter 4, God is the God who gives life to the dead and calls things that are not as though they were, and they come into being. Right? God can't lie. Omnipotence of God doesn't mean he can do anything. It means he can do anything he wants. Can God make a rock so big he can't lift it? That's an absurd question. God doesn't do absurd things. So, no. Or, yeah, he makes the rock so big he can't lift it, and then he lifts it. What? It's an absurd question. Gotcha. No, you didn't. You don't understand God. You're taking God and putting him in the confines of your understanding rather than letting him be who he is. I am who I am. Which then is another really interesting thing. Jacob is wrestling with this man and says, hey, what's your name? And he doesn't answer. He says, why do you ask my name? Now, on the one hand, perhaps this angel of the Lord, this man that Jacob's wrestling, expects Jacob to know. It's like, why are you asking me? You should know this. Right? I'm not sure exactly what the point is in that, but here's an interesting thing. Throughout Genesis so far, people have been naming God. In fact, Hagar, the Egyptian handmaid that Abraham slept with in order that she would become pregnant with Ishmael, she's the first one to give God a name. She gets kicked out with Ishmael from Abraham's tent, his sort of tent complex. She thinks she's going to die. She puts Ishmael under a bush and walks away so she doesn't hear him cry. And God shows up and she gives him the name El Roi, the God who sees. So people have been giving God a name, but Jacob's like, well, what's your name? Which might be interesting. Maybe that's Jacob going, who are you? Other people have been naming you. Which name is like your name? Are you the God who sees? Are you Shaddai, the destroyer? El Shaddai, God the destroyer. Are you Jehovah Jireh, the God who provides? What's your name? But he doesn't answer, which is quite interesting because it's going to be later on in Exodus when Moses has an encounter with the angel of the Lord at the burning bush, and God speaks to him and says, go to Pharaoh, tell him, set my people free, let him go. And Moses says, who shall I say has sent me? And he says, I am who I am. I just am. You can't define me. You can't contain me. Yeah, there are a lot of names that might give reference to my character. There are a lot of names that might give reference to what I'm able to do. But I just am who I am. I will be who I will be. You don't get to define me. My essence defines me. What I just am defines me. So I'm not going to fit in your box. I'm just going to be who and what I am. And then it's up to us to interact with that and decide what we're going to do with it, right? So here we have this God who's like, I'm not telling you my name. What a jerk. He just asked your name. It's just polite society. You asked Jacob's name and he gave you his name. Why can't you just reciprocate? Because God gets to do what God desires to do. Because he's God. It's just kind of that way. Right? But here's the thing. It boggles my mind, to be honest. God wrestles with Jacob. God wrestles with him. Like, I don't know if you've ever wrestled with someone who you could absolutely destroy if you wanted to. I don't know if you've ever, play wrestled. When I used to wrestle with my kids, at any point in time, I could have, actually taken their life. Let's be honest. No, I could have. I'm not, I don't mean to be weird, but, I'm strong enough to choke out a 2-year-old, right? Only just, but let's be honest, right? Okay? It's a weird thing to say at church, but it's truth. But of course I didn't, because I'm not a sociopath or a psychopath or a murderer. Even though I have hated some people in my heart and I need to deal with that, but that's okay. Right? But I wrestle with my kids because in that is some relationship. In that is some bonding. In that, stepping to their level and competing on their terms, according to their ability, allows them to relate to me, allows me to relate to them so that we can bond and build relationship and trust, because actually my goal for my kids is for them to eventually become like me, not in the ways in which I'm quite questionable as a human being, but in the ways in which perhaps I would wish myself to be more consistently, and I would desire for them to be able to be, right? I want to call them up to where I'm at. And this is what God does with us. He steps into where we're at and he wrestles with us. Now, at any point in time, the angel of the Lord could have smashed him. He just touches the hip and says, oh my gosh. And so then Jacob walks with a limp for the rest of his life. Right? But God's desire is to call us up to be more like him. And in order to do that, he steps into the way things are for us. And so, maybe what it is and what we see with these other understandings, God says, you know what, Jacob, you and the people around you, you understand things like river trolls. You understand things like unclean spirits that are bound by the night and then vanish in the day. You're accustomed to these people being nefarious, cursing you, tricking you, giving you riddles, problems you have to solve, being very difficult to please in order to extract anything good from. So I'm going to step into this understanding that you have, and then I'm going to correct that understanding by revealing who I am. I'm the God who wrestles with you, gets stuck in with you. And where you're accustomed to river trolls and unclean spirits that want to trick you, and Jacob, you're a bit of a trickster yourself, I'm an agent of blessing. I could absolutely decimate you right now, as evidenced by just touching your hip, and that's it. But I don't. And when you hold on to me, you don't let me just pass by and vanish with the day. You say, no, bless me. I respect that faith. Here's blessing. God enters into our life as we understand things, corrects our misunderstanding, and as we wrestle with him and cling on to him, he won't leave without a blessing for us. Now that blessing doesn't necessarily mean like, Lord, I'd like $1 billion. You know? That's kind of not how it is. It's deeper and far more profound than that. But all this is evidenced in Jacob's name change to Israel. It means most of the time we understand Israel as being roughly translated one who wrestles with God. Which is interesting because most names that end with the EL suffix, like Daniel, Nathaniel, Gamaliel, all these kind of Hebrew names, actually God isn't the direct object, he is the subject. Daniel, God is my judge. God's the subject of the verb, not the direct object of the verb. And in Israel, we understand it as someone who wrestles with God, but there's a way of understanding the name Israel as standing God wrestles. Because actually you can't wrestle someone without them wrestling you back. God wrestles with us. We got questions about him. What's your name? And he doesn't answer. Why is it like this? Whatever it might be. And he doesn't answer. Please, would you do this? And he doesn't answer. But what he does do is he wrestles with us. And he allows us to wrestle him. Why didn't you ... Why did they ... How come this ... Sometimes we get answers and sometimes we don't. But God is the God who wrestles with us and allows us to wrestle him, even if he could just, metaphorically speaking, touch our hip and we're done. He allows us to cling on to him. Have you ever watched like a rugby player who just knows how to like shirk a tackle? Like people just like fly off of him? God can do that. God can be like, get off me. God allows us to cling on to him. And say, no, I'm not going to let go unless you bless me. And these are just some of the things that we learn from the patriarchs, particularly the patriarch Jacob, whose name gets changed to Israel. And some of the questions for us that we might have from all this is, number one, all right, when stuff in the Bible resembles other things of its time and place, do you go, oh, the Bible's just another copy of that stuff? Well, it's a bit unfair. Jesus talks about this in, is it Matthew or Luke? Talking about him and John the Baptist. He's like, hey, we played the pipe for you and you didn't dance, and we sang a dirge for you and you didn't mourn. When God makes himself understandable in the way we understand things, we go, well, it's just like everything else we understand. But when he remains incomprehensible, we go, well, how am I supposed to understand that? Well, you can't have it both ways. You're just trying to let yourself off the hook. Right? So thing number one is, when we come across stuff in the Bible that seems very similar to other things around, let's recognize that's God stepping into the way we understand things so that we can begin to apprehend him. Secondly, as he subverts what we already know and understand, let's be open to that subversion. You thought it was a river troll and an unclean spirit. No, it's the Lord God Almighty. Are we open to the subversion of our expectation? Thirdly, man, are you ready to wrestle with who God is and what he's like? He is who he is. Are you ready to wrestle with that? Or do you just want a God who's a vending machine of answers to our questions and supply of our requests? Are we ready to wrestle? And fourthly, I don't even know how to count, man. Fourthly, are we ready to not let go? Are we ready to not let go until there's a blessing? Fifth, finally, people who've wrestled with God often walk with a limp. People who've wrestled with God often walk with a limp. No one's perfect, man. This is a place where it's okay to limp. We all got a limp. I don't trust somebody who doesn't limp. Right? It's okay to limp. Limping means you're still walking. So let's keep walking together. Let's not judge each other's limps. Let's just walk together and know that the limp could be good evidence that we're wrestling. Fair? All right, let's stand to sing as we get ready for our time of confession.